Europe Out Loud, a podcast about Europe's history, culture, and civilization. Brought to you by the Martens Center, with Federico Reo.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new episode of Europe Out Loud, our podcast series. We are in the run-up towards the European elections, and that's why we thought we would address the F word of European integration, European federalism. I would like to argue that there is not one, but several ways of being European federalist. Although only some of them are visible in the current debate, others have existed in the history of European integration and maybe could be usefully rediscovered ahead of the European elections and after it. I will present four of them based on the doctrines of European integration that emerged at the beginning of debates surrounding European unity. And I think that it is fair to associate only two of them, admittedly the dominant one, but only two of them with a form of European centralism, a centralist federalism, while at least another two of them should rather be associated with a vision of decentralized and competitive federalism that is very mindful of national and regional identities. So the four streams, I name it very briefly. One is associated, the most famous one, of course, with Altiero Spinelli. Another one, less famous, is associated with Friedrich Hayek, the great Nobel Prize-winning economist. A third one is associated with Jean Monnet, one of the founding fathers of European integration. And the fourth one is associated with Christian democracy more broadly. I don't think we can find a single personality that really embodies it to the extent to which these other personalities embody other streams. What I will try to do is, in the remainder of the episode, I will present each of them in turn, very briefly. I will try maybe also to facilitate comparison, to explain for each of them what is the cultural ideal that they embrace, either openly or implicitly, what is their political model of federalism, and what is their economic model. So I would like to start from what most interpreters of European federalism consider the beginning, but in my opinion wrongly, meaning with Spinellian federalism. Altiero Spinelli was an Italian. He was imprisoned, exiled on a small island in the Mediterranean during the fascist regime. And together with other prisoners, this is well known, in 1941 he published a famous manifesto called the Ventotene Manifesto, which is considered wrongly as the origin of European federalism. Now, if I have to summarize Spinellian federalism based on the three categories that I have introduced, I would say that it is culturally progressive, institutionally centralized, and economically interventionist. I think anyone who reads the Ventotene Manifesto can easily see why I mean so. Economically progressive, this comes from the cultural background of Altiero Spinelli himself. He came from a long militance in the Italian Communist Party. He maintained for all his life a strong egalitarian approach, particularly as far as economic and social questions were concerned. Institutionally, I think it is quite clear when one reads the Ventotene Manifesto that his institutional model is the American federation as developed in the 1930s, so during the very interventionist turn that President Roosevelt gave to it during the New Deal. So it's a model in which the center clearly affirms its superiority, its supremacy over the federated members. That's what I mean when I say that it is a model of centralized federalism. Another very important aspect of Spinellian federalism is its programmatic interventionism as far as economics is concerned. To begin with, it is clear that Spinelli devotes a lot of energies to denouncing the crimes of what he calls capitalist imperialism. But most importantly, he entrusts the federation with openly socialist goals. A totally different model is proposed by Friedrich Hayek. And interestingly enough, around the same time, the first interesting thing I think is that Spinelli published in 1941, Hayek published in 1939, so already 2 years before, and he is not even the first. There is a very interesting blueprint of what I would call classical liberal federalism in an essay of Hayek called The Economic Conditions of Interstate Federalism. The feature, I would say, again, to summarize, Hayekian federalism is culturally liberal, institutionally decentralized, and economically competitive and non-interventionist. Culturally liberal because the goal of federation for Hayek is to maintain peace and individual freedoms. Institutionally decentralized because we are not talking about a strong and intrusive central government, but rather, if one reads Hayek's essay, we are envisaging a limited framework for continental openness, which would deal with core federal functions, which I would summarize, this is not Hayek's language, but I would summarize them as defense, foreign policy, and what we now call the four freedoms of the internal market. So a limited institutional center. There are passages in which Hayek even insists on the need to devolve powers to regions and open up regions and nations within this federated continental space to competition and experimentation. So a very competitive and decentralized federalism. Very interestingly, if Spinelli's federalism is very active, very interventionist, Hayekian federalism is, on the contrary, based on a notion of what today we will call negative integration, meaning it's not about active intervention from the federal level, but it's about reining in interventions of the federated members so as to allow the free movements of capital, services, workers, goods, what we now call the four freedoms of the internal market. So it's based on a notion of negative integration, and if we want, of mutual recognition, we would say today, in the EU jargon. So a very different model of decentralized and competitive federalism. I now come to the third strand of federalism that I have identified, Monnetian federalism. This is associated with Jean Monnet, who is, of course, one of the great founding fathers of European integration. He drafted, as we know, or at least inspired the bulk of the Schuman Declaration of 1949. He was the first president of the High Authority, so the ancestor of the Commission at the time. So a very influential figure. And again, if I have to summarize his federalism, I would say that it is culturally elitist, institutionally technocratic, economically based on planning. Culturally elitist, Monnet is quite clear in this. He believed that it was bureaucratic and economic elites that had to take the lead in building an integrated European order. Now, and here probably it is useful to pause one moment and to stress the fact that many people do not consider Monnet a federalist. My opinion has always been, and I think it is not, I'm not the only one to think like that he basically shared Spinelli's goal as far as the federalization of Europe was concerned. His model was a centralized federation inspired by the United States. The disagreement with Spinelli was primarily on the means to be followed in pursuit of this federation. Spinelli believed that you could have a sort of political big bang that would establish the federation, while Jean Monnet believed in a functionalist method of integration. You know, we start by transferring certain regulatory powers to supranational institutions, independent supranational institutions. This is expected to produce certain spillover effects into other areas, and therefore it will stimulate integration in these other areas, and therefore the sharing of sovereignty in an ever-growing number of fields until we reach a stage in which we can finally federalize. But the final goal of a centralized federation, I think, is basically shared. So, culturally elitist, I think institutionally technocratic, because Jean Monnet was a very careful observer of political developments in the 1920s and 30s, and what struck him was that many democratic majorities and parliaments elected dictators and voted for powers to dictator. Of course, Hitler is a prominent example of this. So he was not crazy in having a technocratic bent. He was trying to shield his project of European integration from this sort of democratic inconveniences. And finally, in terms of economic doctrine, Monnet was also, as it is widely known, he was in charge of the National Planning Authority in France after the war, and he had a vision of interventionist technocratic planning as his basic economic doctrine. I now come very briefly to the last federalist strand, which I have called personalist, because I think the dominant philosophy that inspired it was the personalism of the 1920s and 1930s, and it was associated with Christian democracy. So the first thing to say here is that there is no, as I was mentioning, there is not a single thinker or practitioner or politician that I think can be associated with it. If I have to summarize its features, I would say that it is culturally Christian and personalist, institutionally polycentric, and economically solidaristic. What do I mean by that? Culturally, Christian is quite obvious. There is an attention that is lacking in all other federalist strands to the cultural roots of European federalism, which in the minds of these thinkers are the Christian identity, the common Christian identity of Europe and its nations. There is an institutional attention to polycentrism and autonomy that is rooted in personalism. Personalism, we should remember, is a doctrine that sees the individual human beings embedded in a web of social and political relations that are constructed, if you want, from the bottom up, from the level of the family and the local action up to the level of the region, the nation, and then the continent, in this case. So it proposed an idea of radical federalization both within nation states and at the interstate level. And finally, in terms of economic doctrine, it was solidaristic. It refused both unbridled free markets and individualism on the one end, and state-centered social and welfare system on the other end. It believed that people in their families, in their local communities, had to take the initiative and be primarily responsible for social and economic problems. But I think for our purposes, what is interesting to retain in this federalism is that it is culturally rooted, and it has a bottom-up vision based on subsidiarity, so based on the construction of unity, of federal unity from the bottom up. So I come to my conclusions. The first point I think to make is that, as I have premised at the beginning, I think it is wrong to believe that there is only one way of being European federalist, and there has been only one strand of European federalism in the history of European integration. I have already listed four. I mean, one could in fact go on and probably add one or two more. The second point is that it is true that not all of them have been equally influential in the European integration process, and that the most influential have been the two that are associated with centralist federalism. So Spinellian federalism and Monadian federalism. And I would say that the dominant federalist discourse that you hear in pro-European circles is still a strange mixture of Monet and Spinelli. Spinelli comes to the fore because he's the most political of the two, of course, but there is a lot of Monet in there as well. And of course, the problem with this is that I think these two strands of federalism are associated with some of the problems of European integration that provoked the populist rebellion that we are seeing. A certain leaning towards technocracy, a certain leaning towards elitism, a certain leanings towards bureaucratic regulation of the economy, a certain neglect of the cultural roots of European integration, a certain lack of emphasis on national and regional autonomies. The mistake, of course, of those who criticize this form of European federalism is to believe that it is the only possible form of European federalism. There are at least another two streams which in fact defend a much more decentralized, open, competitive, bottom-up European federalism. And I believe personally, I consider myself a European federalist, but I believe that if European federalism must have a future in the current context, it can only be through a synthesis of Hayekian and personalist federalism that would federate a broad constituency of Christian Democrats, conservatives, liberal conservatives in favor of EU reform.
That was today's episode of Europe Out Loud. Subscribe to our podcasts for more.